We had to wait until OP09 for playable Shanks leader, but it was worth it. Easy to play but hard to master means it's a really good pick for the beginner or new players because you can see how much progress you do on your fundamentals level. And if you invest enough time, the results will come because the leader is easily able to top or even win the events that we already saw in the West. So today, without further ado, I will give you some introduction to this leader, deck building, win condition, and gameplay approach. Shanks is monocolor leader in red with 5 life and 5000 power, so pretty standard, and he has straightforward but amazing defensive leader's effect. Once per turn, this effect can be activated when your opponent attacks. Give up to one of your opponent's leader or character cards minus 1000 power during this turn. In practice, it means that you basically have one extra 1k counter per turn. The best thing about such generic effect is that you have a lot of freedom with your deck building. You can put any red cards that you like and you still can play the game. And because this is such a generic effect that helps us survive early game without much trouble, we can approach the deck building towards win condition that resolves around strong mid game and even late game. So to put it simply, survive early game and start dropping big boys on board to take over the game. So before we move on to card choices and the list, just keep in mind that this is how I would build the deck, but I will also present some tech choices or viable considerations that you can include to express yourself in the deck. Starting with our win condition itself, big boys. In red color, we have a lot of cool choices for the strong top-end characters. And obviously we want to choose the most powerful ones. So let's start with the man himself, 10 cost Shanks. Very simple but powerful card. 10 cost 12,000 power is already really good, but on top of that this card has rush and also has built-in leader's effect but as an aura effect. Give all of your opponent's characters minus 1000 power. So like in manga and anime, if you have Haki, you affect all the weak souls. Amazing card printed in OP09 set to complement the leader Shanks, and for me it's clear staple. I would play at least 3 copies, but I think in current meta, in OP09 environment, we want to play 4 copies of this card. Once you drop it on curve, any aggro deck stops being aggro, and if you are able to play it back to back, it's just back breaking. Another great 10 cost character to choose from is the man, the myth, the legend himself, Goldie Roger. 10 cost 13,000 power rusher, which is amazing in itself. They show the power of the Roger with this simple stat line boost. But on top of that, we have really great effect. When your opponent activates blocker, if either you or your opponent has 0 life cards, you win the game. Very sneaky effect that a lot of players may understand wrong at first, or you can catch them off guard. Because first of all, the criteria is met if either you or your opponent has 0 life cards. A lot of players, especially the new ones, forget about it, and for example they try to push you to 0 life and hide behind the blockers, and then they are surprised when you play the Roger down. And another thing that a lot of players forget when they are still learning the game is that when Roger is on the board, it doesn't matter if he attacks. It might be any other character that is attacking, and your opponent still can't activate the blocker if the condition is met. So quite simple setup is when you have a lot of characters already on board and your opponent tries to hide behind the blocker when he's at 0 life or he pushed you to 0 life. We just play Roger first and then we attack with our characters to prevent the blockers to put any work for our opponent. The card is great, especially in matchups like Black Teach. Additionally, BY Luffy is the nightmare for him to play against Roger for sure, but also if you expect some Bonnie players, you might want to include this card in your deck building. However, I treat Roger more of a tech choice than the staple. So try it yourself, but I would play around 2, maybe even 1 copy, depending on expected meta. Another possible 10 cost pick for your top end is again Shanks, but from the OP06. It's 10 cost 12,000 power character, also known as Film Shanks because of his type, and very simple effect. Again, this is what I really like about red decks, that the effects are really straightforward and you just punch your opponent. In this case, on play, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with 10,000 power or less. Very good card if you expect the meta with so-called tall characters, boss monsters and so on. So for example, if I'm playing locals and I know that a lot of players in my locals play decks like Mirror, maybe Bonnie, maybe Enel, then for sure I want to include this Shanks as my tech into those matchups, because decks like Bonnie, decks like Enel normally play just one threat a turn, and you can threaten them with your Shanks on play effect. However, if the meta is more aggressive, a lot of decks going wide on board, these Shanks might be a little bit too slow to be played. So be mindful of that and make your own decision. For me, from the 10 cost characters, we want to play the OP09 Shanks for sure. For the tech cards like Goldie Roger or Shanks, you need to try and decide yourself, or maybe you find some other spicy 10 cost. Moving on to 8 cost characters, here we also have some spicy picks, and let's start with, in my opinion, the strongest 8 cost red character in the game, and this is Silver's Rayleigh. 8 cost, 8000 power character with the effect that reads: on play, select up to 2 of your opponent's characters and give one character minus 3000 power and the other minus 2000 power until the end of your opponent's next turn. Then KO up to one of your opponent's characters with 3000 power or less. This card is powerhouse. The only downside for such strong card is its type, former Roger Pirates, and currently in the game we don't have any way to find this character. But character itself is so OP that even if it's not searchable, you have to include it in your deck. 4 copies, no questions. This is like the staple of the staples. As we know, red removal resolves mostly about minusing the power of the character. And in this case, Rayleigh is amazing because not only we are reducing 2 characters, we can KO another one that has 3000 power or less. So we can stop aggression of our opponent, we can reduce the characters that are rested, and on top of that we can KO some other character that already has the power on the low level. Let me give you an example. If your opponent has rested 5000 power characters, but he set up a blocker, maybe Rebecca, maybe some other champ blockers that already have low power. By playing Rayleigh, you can basically clean the board if you have enough attacks on board. Minus 3000 power, minus 2000 power on 5k power characters or even 6k power characters is quite backbreaking. Every champ blocker has less than 3000 power or less, so you don't need to reduce it, you can just pop it and then swing into the rested characters to take over the board. And even if the opponent's characters are standing, maybe they didn't swing, they were afraid of the Rayleigh, the reduction effect stays on them until the end of your opponent's next turn. Really important to remember about it. If you have trouble to remember it, use the dice. Put it next to the character of your opponent. Be mindful of that. You don't need to always 100% clear the board. Sometimes it's enough to reduce the characters for one turn. And there is also one very cool interaction that you can do with Rayleigh on Tendon, but I will mention it a little bit later in the guide. So to put it simply, Rayleigh is really great in the board-centric meta. If you have a lot of decks that play on board, especially if they are going wide, like for example Blue Doffy right now, then you want to play Rayleigh for sure. But even if the meta is not so popular with such decks, this card is just too strong not to play it. Moving on to another amazing 8 cost character is Monkey D. Dragon from OP07. This is 8 cost 9000 power character with Rush. On play, give up 2 rested Dawn cards to your leader or one of your characters. As opposite to Riley, this card really shines versus black decks. Because black decks, what they want to do, they want to remove your board. But by playing the characters with Rush, you play around it. The more Rush characters you play, the strongest your matchup is into the black decks. Because it doesn't matter if they remove it in their turn, the character already attack. And this is the main selling point for Monkey D. Dragon. The only consideration with such build is if we play 4 copies of Rayleigh and 4 copies of Monkey D. Dragon, we don't have really a good way to find them depending on the matchups. So we need just a little bit of luck to draw the correct 8 cost versus correct opponent. But as long as we draw the pieces we need, we are unstoppable. So these are our big boys, but we can't rely only on them as our characters because we will simply be too slow on board to threaten anyone. That's why next let's talk about our mid-range characters that, starting from the mid-game itself, will help us to get some board back and prepare the setup for our big drops. Starting with the right hand of Shanks himself, Ben Beckman, another great card printed in OP09. Overall, all the red-haired pirates were mostly printed in this expansion to support the new leader, that is Shanks. And in this example we have the 7 cost character with 7000 power, so might seem a little bit underpowered on this regard, but on play effect, trash up to one of your opponent's characters with 6000 power or less. So normally, if you are forced to go first and you are able to play Ben Beckman on curve, you will be able to remove anything from the board because of the trash effect. As opposed to KO that can be prevented in many different ways, trashing the character from the board is a little bit harder to play around. Not so many characters currently in the game that can prevent such occurrence. So not only we are clearing something on curve, we also develop a character that can swing for magic number that is 7000 power. I think Ben Beckman is a staple in Shanks deck. However, the next characters that I will speak about consider as viable picks, because depending on your meta, on your expectations and the style that you like to play, you might pick many different pieces from the characters that I will present to you and build your deck accordingly. There is no one fit all, so adjust the characters that you put in your deck to your needs, not to my opinion. First decision you need to make is if you want to stay with the theme of the deck and try to keep higher consistency by picking red-haired pirates characters, or do you want to sacrifice the characters type a little bit but be maybe better prepared for some opponents in the meta. Let me give you an example. We have 2 interesting blockers to pick from. One of them is 5 cost Rayleigh and another one is 4 cost Lucky Roo. First difference that you can notice is obviously the cost of them. If we decide to pick Lucky Roo, we need to consider that this is a 4 cost character. So even though the effect itself is really strong, because it's not only the blocker, but also on KO, if your leader has the red-haired pirates type, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with a base power of 6000 or less. We might be not even able to use it. And why? Because we have Blue Doflamingo in the meta that is highly represented, and one of the cards that is the worst enemy of Lucky Roo is Bouncer Low. It can bounce back 4 cost or less character, so it might be that even if we play it against Blue Doflamingo, it will come back to our hand and we just wasted a turn. However, if we expect other decks that resolve around the characters with 6000 power or less, like for example Purple Luffy, Lucky Roo actually might be a great pick. On the flip side, we have Silver's Rayleigh blocker. Again, he's not searchable because of the Roger Pirates type, but it's 5 cost 6000 power character, so it's not so easy to bounce back. It's a blocker, as we already know, and on play effect, if your opponent has 2 or more characters with a base power of 5000 or more, draw 2 cards and rush 1 card from your hand. So it's like we have a queen without a downside in the red decks. And in Doflamingo meta, it's really easy to meet the condition of 2 characters with base power of 5000 or more on our opponent's board. So here is consideration for you if you prepare for your locals, maybe some bigger tournament. You need to ask yourself, am I more afraid of Doffy or am I more afraid of Purple Luffy? You can always try and split, maybe play 2 copies of Riley, 2 copies of Lucky Roo, and hope that you draw the correct one in the correct moment. Personally, in OP09, I would choose Rayleigh as my blocker of choice, but you can also try to play both and later decide if it's working out for you or maybe you want to focus on one blocker. After choosing your blocker, another mid-range characters that you can choose, I would like to group like a specific packages. So if we expect the decks that have a lot of removal, especially black decks, then I would play Broadcast the Ace from the starter deck 15 and 5 cost Marco. They are really sticky characters that will help you a lot in the black matchup, and Ace itself might help you a lot against Doffy as well, because of his effect. Once per turn, if this character would be removed from the field by your opponent's effect, you may give this character minus 2000 power during this turn instead. And here is the keyword, removed from the field. So even if your opponent plays, for example, Jozu doesn't do anything. You play Ace on your 5-down turn and most likely he will stick on board, because there is no clean answer to this character. But again, by playing such characters, we improve our black matchup, but we lower our consistency for the on-team red-haired pirates. If we want to stay more true to the archetype, there is another package to consider. And this package is 5 cost Yasop and 7 cost Whitebeard. Those 2 cards look like they were custom made for going first curve to give you unfair advantage. Yasop obviously is red-haired pirates type character. His effect reads on play up to one of your leader gains 1000 power until the end of your opponent's next turn. Secondary effect with 1 don't attach. When attacking, give up to one of your opponent's characters 1000 power during this turn. On paper, really strong, really great into aggro meta. The only downside for Yasop is that if we play him and we are against Blue Doflamingo, it can be easily bounced by Jozu. And then we kind of wasted the turn. Sure, our leader is buffed, but on the other hand, our 5-Dawn came back to hand. So this is the only consideration. Other than that, the card is really, really great, especially if we play 7 cost Whitebeard. And why is that? Because of the on-play effect. For 7 Dawn, we play 8000 power Edward Newgate. On play, give up to 1 rested Dawn card to your leader or one of your characters. So like I said, we can afford to play them on curve going first. And then the secondary effect is activate main. You may rest this character KO up to one of your opponent's characters with 5000 power or less. So if you played Yasop, it's stick on the board. If you follow up with Edward Newgate, you simply attach the Dawn from Edward Newgate effect to the Yasop, swing with the Yasop, reduce some character, for example 6000 power character down to 5000 power, and now you can rest the Edward Newgate to clear another character. Very powerful combo. If you are able to pull it off, it can really give you a lot of tempo in the game, and maybe your opponent cannot catch up, and then you just play your usual stuff. 8 cost Rayleigh, 8 cost Dragon, then 10 cost Shanks, and the game is done. So consider this package as well, depending how afraid are you of your Yasop being bounced by Jozu, but it might be worth risking this small addition of those 2 cards instead of some other choices. Or on the other hand, if you are afraid of black decks, then maybe better to put into the deck Ace and Marco. Decision is yours. Those two packages I would consider. Other characters, not so much. Okay, we have our boss monsters, our big boys, our strong mid-range to start taking over the board. But like I mentioned, to get into this stage, when we are cool and we drop all the big stuff on board, we need to get there. And together we need to be a little bit defensive in the early game. So that's why now let's talk about 2k counters. And let's start with the ones that actually have the type of Red Heart Pirates. One of them is Hongo. 2k counter, 3 cost character with 3000 power and effect that reads activate main. You may rest this character. If your leader has the Red Heart Pirates type, give up to one of your opponent's characters minus 2000 power during this turn. So as we already know, in One Piece card game, when you play the 2k counters, you also want them to have some utility. And Hongo is really interesting character because you can play him on board if you have any return to do that. And especially if you play 5 cost Marco, for example, you can combo his effect nicely the next turn to remove some pesky characters from board. And not only that, he is also cosplaying blocker because once you rest him, your opponent have to attack into him. His effect is activate main, so if they don't clear him, you can minus 2000 power again. And in combination with so many red removal effects based on the opponent's character's power, this might be backbreaking for your opponent. Another 2k counter choice is Lime Juice, and here again we have 3 cost character with really interesting utility effect. On play, your opponent cannot activate up to one blocker character that has 4000 power or less during this turn. So once again, in OP09 we have a lot of chomp blockers, but even if they play some higher powered blockers, we can combo our power reduction to prevent one of the other bigger blockers from blocking. Let's say our opponent played Sabo. Sabo is 6000 power character, but it's enough that we reduce the power of the Sabo by minus 2000, and then we can target him with Lime Juice. Really sneaky card just for free Dawn investment. We might surprise our opponent and push through the blockers. Next, we have all-time classic for the red decks. This is the uncommon that is one of the strongest red cards ever. And this is our little Otama. First printed in OP01, 2k counter that for 1 cost on play, give up to one of your opponent's characters minus 2000 power during this turn. And in a deck and in the color that cares a lot about power of your opponent's characters, either to remove them or play around them, this little girl puts enormous work into the field. Even with just mentioned Lime Juice. Like I said, let's say our opponent played Sabo. If you play Otama for 1, Dawn, you reduce Sabo to 4000 power, then you just play Lime Juice and Sabo is not blocking this turn. How cool is that? 4 Dawn and you just skip the blocker completely. Not to mention other cool combos like reducing rested characters and swinging into them, or reducing them additionally in combo with your 8 cost Rayleigh. A lot possibilities. Even when you play 5 cost Marco on your 6 Dawn turn, you play Otama, you play Marco, you clear something. Amazing utility card. I think this is the best red card in the game, period. If you don't have playset of Otama, buy it now. You will use it sooner or later if you are a red deck player. And the last 2k counter of choice is also one of the classics, mostly known from the Zoro decks. And this is 2 cost Sanji. 2 cost Sanji is really interesting card against the matchups that like to take the game really slow, maybe try to even starve you, prevent your access to the cards, and you just want to speed up the matchup a little bit. Because Sanji's effect reads activate main once per turn, you may add 1 card from your life area to your hand. This character gains 2000 power during this turn, then give this character up to 2 rested Dawn cards. This is amazing because not only we are getting resource from our life, not only we are buffing Sanji for plus 2000 power, But on top of that, we can develop our board and still attach 2 rested Dawn cards to our Sanji character. So in effect, we are netting +1 card from life, and we buff Sanji in total for 4000 power. Very, very crucial card in the slower matchups. And like I said before, we really want to survive into our mid-game, late-game threats. That's why we play 4 copies of each 2k counter. That is in total 16 2k counters. Quite a lot, but trust me, if you are able to slow game in the early terms long enough, then you just chill and start dropping big boys to take over the game. Moving on to the event cards. Let's speak first about the defensive events, just to make our defense even stronger. And here I would choose one of the defensive event cards. It would be either Bad Manners Kick Curse, Guard Point, or Radical Beam. All of these choices have pros and cons. However, out of the 3, I would pick zero cost event. And it's because, as you maybe noticed, yes, we play 16 2k counters, but we also play some bricks. So if we are unlucky, we might have trouble with countering the attacks of our opponent. Not only that, we also want to play on curve. So it's really hard to find the turns where we will have the Dawn up, especially in later stages of the game when we want to just start dropping 10 cost after 10 cost. And in such situations, zero cost event is amazing because it's constant 3000 power counter without any condition. The only requirement is trashing card from hand, but if it's already a brick, you can as well just trash it. To top all of that, we have a trigger. Give up to one of your opponent's leader or character cards -3000 power during this turn. Sometimes this -3000 power can really mess up the math and can win you the game. So please consider zero cost event first, and if you don't like it, then maybe include Guard Point or Radical Beam, but be mindful that you need to pay a Dawn for them. They are not free events in a sense like Bad Manners. And lastly, I would like to speak about the event that was such a great discovery in Asia during their OP09 metagame, and this is Red Hawk. Card printed back in a day in OP01 meta. This is 2 cost counter event that reads up to one of your leader or character cards gain +4000 power during this battle. Then KO up to one of your opponent's characters with 4000 power or less. So event is really strong, especially in the early stages of the game versus aggressive decks. And why is that? Because of the game rules and how countering works. So if your opponent attacks you with 5000 power character, first you decide if you activate your leader's effect, so-called haki. What you can do if you have 2 Dawn up, you reduce the 5000 power character that is on opponent's board. In this way, you make it 4000 power. You see where this is going. Play the Red Hawk, clear the character from board, and on top of that you have 4000 power counter. All of that just for 2 Dawn. The only downside is that your opponent will most often see that you have 2 Dawns up, especially in the early game. So they might choose to play around it, either by attaching Dawn, maybe playing character later, and so on. But just the knowledge that you might have Red Hawk in hand and they see 2 Dawn up might force them into many weird decisions through the game, especially if they are not experienced player, maybe they don't know how to play around certain events. So for me in OP09 meta, especially that we have the deck that is Blue Doflamingo, the Red Hawk is a must-have in a deck. I really like this version of the Shanks deck. I think this is correct way to play it in such aggro meta. And also not only that, but something that I promised earlier. If you play Rayleigh on your 10 Dawn turn, remember, please always put a dice or something to remind yourself that opponent character or characters are reduced, because then you just leave 2 Dawn open and it will be really hard for your opponent to play around Red Hawk. They have limited amount of Dawn if they attach all of them at start to prevent the Red Hawk, it will be really easy for you to count which attacks you need to counter, which attacks use Haki on, and so on. And not only that, on top of all of that, the trigger is crazy. Give up to one of your opponent's leader or character cards minus 10,000 power during this turn. How cool is that? You can win so many games just based on this trigger alone. That's why I think 4 copies of Red Hawk, sure, you don't have many occasions to play it. Like realistically, you will play Red Hawk either on your 2-don turn or 3-don turn, because normally you don't have anything interesting to play. And then maybe on the 10-don turn if you play some lower cost characters, if you don't have 10 cost Shanks. But even then, even when you have 10 cost Shanks on board, if the game takes longer than needed for some reason, your Shanks is reducing the power of opponent characters all the time. So if you combine it with your leader's effect, double Haki, so to say, then you have really easy removal just for the 2-don and still huge counter power of 4,000. And lastly, for the card choices, I would like to speak just shortly about the consistency. So maybe if you are a really new player or are worried about the consistency of the deck, maybe you don't feel confident that you will draw your pieces, you can play the version with a lot of red herd pirates and choose to play Searcher Uta and Searcher Event. And it's also a really cool team. If you play more casually, don't care that much about being competitive, it might be something cool, so-called pet deck, that you have all the crew together in your deck to play. But if you are a more competitive player, then I would sacrifice a little bit of this consistency, so to call it, to be more powerful in the deck itself, as the deck space is really limited, and it might be smarter to put more powerful punchy cards that realize your win condition a little bit better than relying on searchers and red herd pirates. But like I said, for the deck building, decision is yours. If you are a really fresh player, you want to have some more consistency and fun, maybe start with this deck list. And if you want to be more competitive, maybe try this one and adjust singular card choices to your local meta. Moving into turn order and mulligan portion of the guide, with Shanks we are quite flexible, going first, second, depending on our matchups. So most of the time try to think what your opponent wants to do and counter them this way, either steal the curve. For example, you are playing against Purple Luffy. Purple Luffy normally wants to go first, so why not? We will go first and put them off curve. The same goes for the decks like, for example, Teach, for example, Doflamingo. But still, it's not the end of the world if you go second, because actually our curve going second is much stronger. We have our big boys on curve. So the main difference is if you want to play your 5 cost or 7 cost characters first, or do you prefer to play your 8 cost and 10 cost characters faster, or maybe even get additional card. So if you are not sure, maybe better go second, but if you know what your opponent wants to do and what you want to do in any given matchup, then obviously choose accordingly. And this is strictly connected with the mulligan rules. As you maybe notice, we play many different deck cards and we can play much more depending on the build. So you want to mulligan accordingly. In the matchups, when maybe you want to stick your 5 cost character first that cannot be removed if you play version with Marco and Ace, and then follow up with your 7 cost character, you obviously want to mulligan for them. In One Piece card game, the concept of tempo is really important, and if you miss your characters, especially if you don't play searchers, you need to draw them manually. If you miss your play, then you are basically doing nothing during your turn. So always, regardless of the deck that you play, you need to put focus on the turns that you plan to do something. With Shanks, we know that most often first 2 turns we are not going to do much. Maybe develop some reducer, maybe gem our opponent rested character, maybe save some don for the sneaky Red Hawk. But our most important turns are turn 3 and forward. So we like to put priority on 5 cost character, 7 cost character if we are going first, if we are going second, it's really important to have the correct 8 cost character in hand. So don't be afraid sometimes to mulligan for your Rayleigh if you are playing against the Flamingo, or for your Dragon if you are playing against Stitch, for example. Be flexible, stay open-minded, because this is how you improve in the game. It doesn't bring much value if I tell you now, okay, pick this or that, because later you might face some off-meta leader and you will start thinking, okay, it was not in the guide, what should I do now? Practice makes perfect. Try out many different approaches, but remember this simple rule. You want to be able to play the game first. If you can't play your cards, then what's the point of keeping the hand? And here comes the conclusion of the deck, because playing the deck when you have cards in hand, it's quite easy. Like I said, first 2 turns you will either pass, save the Dawn for the Red Hawk if you play against aggro deck, or if your opponent has an arrested character on board, just attach the Dawn to leader and swing into it. In the meantime, you will try to stay healthy either by using your leader's effect or countering early for the attacks that require 1 card investment, and moving into your 5-6 Dawn turn, you just drop the 5 cost that you have. 7 Dawn turn, Ben Beckman, go, clear the board. 8 Dawn turn, depending on the matchup, 8 cost Rayleigh, 8 cost Dragon. And then we are already at 10 Dawn, so we are having fun smashing down the 10 cost Shanks. But the main progress and the main knowledge will be gained from practicing each matchup and each situation yourself. You will find yourself into situations when you need to really think if you should use Haki now or later, if you should keep the Dawn up for Red Hope maybe, if you should still attack into opponent's characters or focus more on going live. But those decisions are not connected to the Red Shanks deck exclusively. Those are the decisions that we need to do in each deck. Just in Shanks, it's even more important and even more visible because your curve is so straightforward. Like in the Purple Luffy deck that I also made the guide some time ago. You can check it probably here. And trust me, this is huge satisfaction when you start noticing those small differences that you can improve. And because of that, I will be releasing slowly the fundamentals guides, going one by one for certain areas of the game, like attacking, defending, Dawn attachment, tempo, and so on. So it's for sure something to wait for. So subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the future guides. But that's it for today. Let me know in the comments, how do you like the Shanks as a leader? Is he the coolest, or do you like some other leaders better? Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Bye bye.